يا هلا 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 حن قلبي على جمعة الخير هلا حن قلبي على جمعة الخير هلا يا هلا ويا هلا ويا هلا ويا هلا يا هلا ويا هلا ويا
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the program. It's a Saturday morning and I try and keep the lighter stuff for a Saturday morning, but I guess it was a coincidence that the two interviews that we're doing today are both with lawyers, and it is the serious stuff. And I guess some Saturdays you just have to cover the serious stuff because it's stuff that's happening around us and we need to be aware of how we respond or react, or also just be aware of what's going down and what you as a concerned citizen should be doing to help support. So in the first part of the interview, we'll be talking with Ibrahim Patelia. He is an attorney, he runs Mediate Works, and we're going to be looking at sexual harassment in the workplace. Later on, we're going to be talking to Mo Valley, also an attorney, but this time around we're going to be talking protection orders. But really it's a coincidence that these two interviews happen to be scheduled at the same time, but I have no doubt you're going to glean some very, very valuable information throughout both the interviews. So do join us and stay with us till 10 this morning. Assalamu alaikum, welcome to the program.
Wa alaikum salam, Auntie Julie. Thank you for having me on the program.
Always a pleasure because you come with a wealth of knowledge and you share such pertinent information with us on the show. Off air we were talking about the patriarchal society that we're living in, and sometimes not only our girl children but even our boy children are not aware of rights. They're not aware when they're crossing lines, when they're crossing boundaries, and they could get themselves into very, very serious trouble. Let's park that for a minute. I'm going to start out by talking about an amazing seminar that you've put together, which of course talks to exactly sexual harassment. So let's look at the seminar and then we'll talk about the actual issue. When and why is it happening?
Okay. So let me deal with the why part. I think the seminar deals with combating sexual harassment in the workplace. I think it's no coincidence that we have a huge publicity for the last few years around sexual harassment in different environments, whether in the States with famous actors and directors, but also locally where organizations have really shown to be struggling with sexual harassment. So the idea of the seminar actually fits in within our business to ensure that organizations and individuals are able to cope with the real risks in their relationships. And in employment relationships specifically, sexual harassment is one of those things that are, thought about but not actually adequately understood or managed. So the seminar is actually an opportunity for us to bring in our clients and those that are interested, even if they are small businesses, because the compliance factor we'll talk about later even applies to a small business or individual employees. So it's to get an expert in from the university who is an expert in the field from an academic perspective. With myself, we'll be sharing some practical tips and thoughts around what the courts are saying, making it a lot more interesting from a practical perspective, but it is a serious topic like you've said. And we want to engage the audience so that they leave hopefully with an understanding of its importance to manage, but also with some idea of what are the key areas and factors to be looking at in an organization. So it's happening on the 28th of February, and it's a breakfast seminar. So it starts off at around 8 o'clock in the morning at the Rooftop Cafe restaurant on Oxford Road in Saxonville. And so I've invited you and anyone that's interested to come through to the seminar. We guarantee it would be of value. And they can go to our website, which is www.mediateworks.com under the events section.
How long have you allocated time-wise for the actual seminar? And apart from you, and you've also indicated that there'll be a lecturer from Wits University, talking about these issues, what else are you having that you're going to uncover during the course of the morning?
So we're going to try and keep the seminar pretty succinct, because we understand people need to actually go back to their businesses, and a lot of our clients are corporate clients in HR, ER, etc. So it's no more than 2 hours. So it is quite jam-packed. And the Kamini Pillay is the person that's going to be speaking. She's the guest speaker. She's a specialist in...
She's a lecturer, isn't
yes,
she?
Yes, she's a lecturer, and she's doing her doctoral thesis in this very area, and has advised many companies in terms of managing sexual harassment in the workplace. And she's one of our associates. So there's this huge opportunity to actually now engage a highly ranked expert who's passionate about this area.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so a person would come along, they'd hear a presentation, pick up some tips, and then we'll open it up for conversation and discussion. And so there's a huge networking opportunity as well for people to come through, especially businesses, employees that are interested, and even if there's students who want to come through. And there's a fully fledged buffet breakfast as well that's included in it, so people won't go away hungry.
Absolutely. How serious, and we are in a patriarchal society, and do you believe that these type of discussions is going to start breaking down those barriers? It's going to start making our fathers, our brothers and our sons wake up and realize that we've got to stop doing what we're doing. We've got to stop interacting or behaving to the females in our spaces differently. They are our equals, and they need to be respected.
No, absolutely. I think the question of will it make a difference? I think we always live in hope. And I think you've done wonderful work, and other people on these platforms, to encourage awareness and education. From a legal perspective, there's a very comprehensive piece of legislation, aside from our constitution in South Africa, that deals with the protection against discrimination. And discrimination includes sexual harassment, amongst others. And this has been in place for just over 20 years. And the reality is that I don't think we've even touched on actually addressing the deep difficulties that are faced. If you look at this Me Too movement that has been started...
against Harvey Weinstein and a
Exactly.
whole host of others.
Yeah, and people like Bill Cosby and politicians in this country, we're often staggered by the amount of people that suddenly come through. And it should be telling us that there isn't really much being done, especially given the number of people that are affected by it and the extent of the period of time in which it has taken place. And it only comes through in the media, or we become aware of it because of one brave soul that suddenly decides to say, this is enough. So your question earlier was, will it make a difference? I think awareness is critical. I think the awareness factor is critical. But conduct is the most important, because as much as we know what is right, we are often in our relationships and workplaces, we revert back to instinct, or what I've seen someone do, or culturally it's okay. And most importantly, we react to people based on our perception of power. And males do dominate. They dominate in terms of environments in which they run organizations. They have a sense of dominance in the home, etc. And so often that position of power is what in fact creates the opportunity, if they want to use it, of discrimination and harassment. So I agree with you, Auntie Julie, that absolutely we want to create an awareness. But I think it comes down to each individual. If legal compliance and publicity doesn't actually make a difference to how people conduct themselves, then it's purely a choice. I think recently as well, if I may just use an example, last year in South Africa of Grant Thornton, I mean, there was an uproar on media houses like 702 about an individual employee who claimed sexual harassment. And in her view, and I think if we look at it objectively, Grant Thornton didn't manage this pretty well. The implications to the individual and the implications to the organization was clear. It's devastating because it's crisis management. It's far too late. And so there's a lot of opportunity, like everything in life, to talk about what can we do preemptively. Awareness is one of it. Conduct changing and positive action is quite important as well.
I'm going to put a slightly different spin on the discussion now.
All right.
I want to try and be as objective as I possibly can from my point of view, which is a woman. You spoke about men being in positions of power, men being dominant, and we know, sadly, that even with the American Me Too movement, at the time all of those atrocities were being perpetrated against these women without being shut down. I'm going to say this very boldly and very bravely. Some women actually encouraged it. Because they needed something out of that interaction or that relationship. They needed a job, they needed position, they needed power, and possibly got what they wanted out of that interaction or that relationship and then moved on. They may not be of the hundreds of thousands that have added their voice to the Me Too movement and other movements all around the world. So men are in a very precarious situation here, are they not? And I talk, from a point of view, I have boy children, and I often wonder, if they step a foot out of line, they could be in serious legal problems. They could be they could be in trouble with the law.
No, absolutely. I think that fear factor is there. But you raise an interesting point in terms of, 2 points that I want to touch on is one, what's the implications in terms of males conducting themselves? Because there's a hypersensitivity, perhaps. There's a sense that, we'll always get branded. And there is a real risk at times that you are falsely accused. And it's one of those allegations that if you're smeared with it, irrespective of whether you're guilty or not, the reality is that that damage will rest with you for the rest of your life. And this applies to organizations as well. And so it is quite important. And I'll come back to that just in a moment, because that is an important factor to deal with. We should not tolerate false accusers. But we should also manage the situation in a manner that preserves the potential rights of both individuals. That's the alleged perpetrator and the complainant. But when we rewind slightly in terms of people benefiting out of whether it's a female or male benefiting out of this, what's interesting about that is that even if there is a benefit for an individual, but that benefit is found because they've got to toe the line with the person in a position of power. The person in the position of power effectively is using that opportunity, that position they have, the opportunity to say yes for a job or yes for whatever that they hold the discretion on. That particular individual has then the choice to say, well, should I benefit unfairly from this? And that's in some sort of sexual misconduct, okay? And sexual misconduct is
so you're saying the man should let common sense prevail?
Absolutely. I think
the onus rests with him.
And in most discrimination, we often don't realize that we have that power. So it would often start off with just a gesture or a comment.
Okay. I think it's very important that we unpack this as much as we can, but let's go for an ad break.
Sure.
I'm talking to Ibrahim Patelia from Mediate Works. We're talking sexual harassment in the workplace. And of course, we're not going to be able to unpack everything or most of what we'd like to touch on, but there is a seminar coming up on the 28th of February, and it's being held at the Rooftop Restaurant in Saxonville, Johannesburg. And if you'd like to attend, please just go to the Mediate Works website and you can sign up there. Don't go away. We're going to have an extra long interview with Ibrahim today because there's lots to cover on the show. Welcome back. We're talking sexual harassment in the workplace with attorney Ibrahim Patelia. He is from Mediate Works. He's also based in Rosebank, Johannesburg. Just before we go back to the questions that we raised before the ad break, I'm wondering, have we failed as a society? Should we not be actually making our boy and girl children, for that matter, aware about these issues from an early age? Should schools not be expounding these messages as well?
Absolutely.
Because we've heard what's happening at universities. We've heard about quite a number of rape cases at university, and you kind of think at a tertiary institution as a university, people are there to learn, people are there, young people are there to take responsibility and not get involved in such heinous acts.
No, absolutely. I think when you say fail, you're quite right. I think and you've raised this a few times, and I have to agree that when we look at these situations, it's not a commercial risk only. It's a societal problem. What's going on in the homes? What are the kids seeing as normal behavior and conduct? When they go into educational institutions, they see a patriarchal system. They see people dominated. They're exposed to mainly female educators who have, in some instances, found their role in a very subordinate relationship. And these things rest with people over a period of time. And workplaces themselves are structured in this way. In fact, there's a higher tolerance subconsciously for discrimination than actually the other way around. Okay, we won't say this openly, but we accept a lot. I think we accept a lot, and we need to, with our kids, with our relationships, is call this out and say, well, this is unacceptable. We need to actually make a conscious choice. I think this is very important, is that there is a conscious, positive choice that we start changing the way we act and react. And I think it's more than anything around respect, etc., that we know we must have. But consciously we need to say, well, I'm going to respond differently. I'm not going to use my position of power for my selfish interests. It's like any addiction, and I'm not saying this is an addiction, is that the first time it's maybe difficult, but then it becomes easy because it becomes something that I'm not getting slapped on the wrist for. I got away with it. It's amazing, I can do this here. And it becomes a bravado issue as well. And then it's just simply accepted. Groups of friends, if we sit around over dinner, I think the conversations that we have, in fact, normalizes all forms of discrimination, and we don't realize it. It becomes a subject of jokes, whether it's racism, sexual harassment, your role, my role, etc. But this establishes the norm. That is what we are now going to accept. And once we accept it, that's how we respond.
And you kind of wonder in these social settings, who's going to be brave enough to say, hang on guys, what we're saying here, what we're discussing here is not on. We're talking about power, we're degrading, we're degrading the women in our circles, in our society. And never mind they are in positions of power in their workplace, but why don't they take that role when other men get together with them and start degrading women and make sexual innuendos, etc., etc.?
Absolutely. I think it takes a lot of bravery. But also it's this dynamic of sexual harassment and all forms of harassment and discrimination, that there's a deep psychological impact. It's not only a legal thing.
True.
And that the responses and reactions of people, whether it's in the social setting or you ask the question, and people would ask it, but why didn't she say no?
Absolutely.
Or
the way she was dressed. And
exactly.
she was obviously and she encouraged it.
And what we find and even the courts are acknowledging this, is that when you're a victim of sexual harassment, there's many potential responses. And even in these social settings, one of the things that we're concerned about is our social standing in that group. Must I stand out? Do I actually then respond to this and take on the challenge? There's a feeling of discomfort, but maybe if I don't say anything, it will go away over a period of time. Maybe he or she will change their behavior. It's not for me to change them, but then it gets progressively worse. And in fact, it gets to the point where it's now intolerable. And if we look at it objectively, things have gone wrong. So, you raise the point. There's nothing wrong in all relationships where there is these minor, and I'm not talking from an Islamic perspective, but if you look at relationships in workplaces, there's this very minor flirtation that takes place or minor comments. But that's the start. I think you have to ask yourself, is it appropriate in this relationship? So that's not wrong per se. But then what will happen with every one of these instances is that the next time it'll be something more. It'll be a little touch. Then it'll be something more. And then eventually the person themselves reach a point of complete breakdown. Because the psychological impact, and I'm not a psychologist, but I'm just having looked at it from a legal perspective, impact on the victim is enormous. They suffer in hugely in terms of their own psychological standing, their own self-worth, etc., their own context in their homes. They may impact upon their relationships differently, how they see themselves. And they're dealing with it alone.
And yet we kind of perceive the situation, when you talk sexual harassment, we expect it to be something really huge, a very forceful gesture from the male to the female. It could be the other way around as well, but mainly, obviously, it's the man in the workplace that tries to take advantage of his female co-worker or subordinate or whatever the case may be.
Absolutely.
And when we hear, and I've seen this reaction from time to time, and when we hear, oh, he just called her sweetie, or he just patted her on the back, or, you know, flicked her hair out of her face, etc., and the rest of the organization kinds of, so you're victimized twice, because here you've been a victim of sexual harassment and everybody else is ganging up on you because they think you're blowing things out of proportion.
Yeah, and why are you picking on him?
Very similar to the 702 case.
Exactly, very similar to that. And there was this famous case in 2017 with Liberty as well. And in this instance, the lady that was affected by this, it was gestures that he had made, and he had invited her to meetings where no one else was present, and he was creating an opportunity for himself to use his position of power to start doing a bit more, touching her, etc. And the first thing she did was approach him, and in her mind, and she talks about this, is that, you know, all men are like this. He's behaving just like a typical man, almost rationalizing his conduct. Now we can say, well, she should know better, she should be empowered, but that's her response to the situation. In fact, it indicates the level of disempowerment, the level of victimhood that the person that's been affected by this feels at that moment. And we take that for granted. And we accept rational conduct, we accept bravery, and I've seen situations where I've chaired inquiries and investigated matters on discrimination in organizations, that these are powerful people, and you ask yourself why they're behaving this way. It's because that effect of discrimination is such, that effect of harassment is such, that it in effect strips you away of your actual ability to start managing the situation logically and wisely. And hence the responsibility often rests with organizations. And at home rests with us as parents, in educational institution, with leadership, in how we inculcate a different culture.
So Ibrahim, when you say that this rests with us as parents at home and organizations as well, what ought they be doing? I mean, apart from putting huge signs up all over the place, what's this responsibility that you're referring to? What ought to be done in the workplace? That's question number one. And then question number two, what is sexual harassment? I mean, you could be a really good person, not taking advantage as a man in a position of power, not taking advantage of the situation, and you make a very innocent remark, and somebody turns the remark or the gesture totally out of context and then slams you with sexual harassment.
Sure.
So let's try and unpack what, where and how you navigate in the workspace. So you know, either one of you don't become a victim, because in a situation like this, let's face it, both of you are victims, because once you get hauled to the courts or to the CCMA or wherever,
Absolutely.
Both are victims.
Yeah. So, and that's in fact the difficulty. And we're never going to get it perfectly right from a legalistic point of view. Sexual harassment is unwarranted sexual conduct. And if, in effect, one of the it includes direct and indirect. So direct is obviously physical conduct in the ways that we think of sexual harassment, but it's also indirect. It's those innuendos, the comments, it's environments, how they establish, it's exclusions in terms of males hanging together and making these comments. So there's subtleties in terms of it, and our law recognizes both the indirect subtle elements and the direct ones. Now, when it comes to how we manage the situation, you're absolutely right, is that we are in a situation that we potentially have to walk on eggshells, like they say. You know?
And nobody wants to be in a
and no one wants
situation
to be
like that.
There's normality in relationships.
Yes.
I mean, we could be having a conversation and neither of us feeling intimidated by the conversation, but it could be robust. It could be a trivial conversation and neither of us are feeling intimidated or harassed.
Right.
And it could be a flirtatious one as well. And I think therein lies the absolute, is that firstly, for sexual harassment to occur, it's not my intention that matters. I could have intended it not to be harassment. It's how you have interpreted it. And therein lies a greater danger.
Ooh.
Therein lies a greater danger, because it's, you know, it's like pulling out a gun and saying, well, I'm going to aim at you and take a shot, and maybe it misses you or hits you, but, you know, I didn't intend to hurt you. It sounds ridiculous. But sexual harassment or discrimination is exactly like that. If it comes out of the mouth while I respond, and you feel the hurt and the pain as an individual, it's happened. But how do we start the journey? I think there's a lot given to us in terms of the legislation. And I think even in this Liberty case, and if you look at Grant Thornton, in the South African context, we've got wonderful law. And often these organizations have wonderful policy. But there's a limitation in terms of whether they actually carry it out. So the first thing that any organization must do is to start educating from a change in terms of behavior and culture. Because what's acceptable in terms of my home, my culture, is not what we want in terms of a workplace. Workplaces should establish a culture. We actually have to unlearn a lot of the things that we've grown up to know. Okay, it's how we comment on things. These things are not acceptable in workplaces, so there should be a strong educational component. And also for the potential complainants, they should start understanding where do they have to actually bring out their complaints. There needs to be a safe and confidential environment. A lot of these complaints are left for a long period of time because people actually feel it's unsafe for me to talk to him or her. Also, there's a stigma. Talking about you feeling this is actually a stigma. So safe environments are quite crucial for workplaces to establish with the right kind of experts. And it sounds like a lot of investment, but it's important because the risks are very high with sexual harassment, because it's one of those instances, if an employee of an organization does it without the actual involvement of the employer will be held liable. Okay, because it happens in the workplace. They should have known better. They should have put better precautionary measures in place.
Okay, we've got to go for an ad break. When we come back, let's look at what happens when a complaint is lodged against a senior superior or a male person, or even a female for that matter. A complaint is lodged. What do we need to see rolling out? What sort of action needs to be taken against the person? And in terms of some sort of monetary settlement, do you believe that that's a good idea? Or perhaps is that then the aim or the intention on the part of either one of the parties? All of that more coming up right after the ad break. We are talking sexual harassment in the workplace, serious issues. Even if you run a small little business, I think you need to take note of this, because you could become a target, either, you know, being harassed or someone accusing you of sexual harassment. Sexual harassment is what we're talking about with Ibrahim Patelia from Mediate Works. They're based in Rosebank, Johannesburg. And don't forget the upcoming seminar on the very subject, sexual harassment. It's happening on the 28th of February at the Rooftop, and it's a breakfast. So if you'd like to book for that, please go to the Mediate Works website. We spoke about a whole host of things. Let's go back to the issue around the victim. Never mind secondary, she's going to be victimized for the rest of her life in that company. Sometimes things become so tenuous that either she or both parties have to leave, because it's just not a comfortable space to be in any longer. She stood up for her rights, but people are going to be so wary of her. They don't intend marginalizing her, but out of sheer nervousness, they step back. What do you say to something like that? And does she have a further case now against the company?
Unfortunately, this is the type of situation that is once it's happened, whether it's true or not true, I think all the parties involved in that would suffer greatly.
Absolutely.
And it's worse so if it's true, of course. And I think it's far too late if it's happened. And organizations often have these structures in place that say, well, it can't happen because we've got disciplinary process, there's punitive measures, etc. And for organizations themselves, they could suffer huge damages complaints. I mean, in the Liberty matter, they had to pay out R250,000 besides costs for an individual that was left to fend for herself effectively. But the punitive measures are there. We shouldn't discount them. But what you're saying is, in fact, more important, is that there's the preservation of the individual.
Yeah.
And the preservation of the individual requires us all, from a societal perspective and organizational perspective, to have a zero-tolerance approach to this in the way we educate people to actually deal with the small stuff. The small stuff are important because if we don't deal with the small stuff, it is a problem. Organizations should have an early detection mechanism where they see things going on. They should be a lot more aware that they need to take earlier action. And
For example,
and I'll use this Liberty example as well. The lady raises the issue with the manager directly. He obviously, the one that's perpetuating this. The second time she raises it with another manager, and all they do is that, here's the disciplinary code and procedure, here's the grievance procedure, there's your right to the CCMA. At that particular moment, things were not so drastic. And I'm not saying it wasn't drastic for her because he had touched her. It hadn't gone further than what, beyond this. It was the second time that it had happened. At that particular moment, the obligation on that employee was to seek, there's a couple of things. One is that listen to the person attentively, give them that space. It has to be a safe environment. In fact, the very first barrier could be us listening to a victim, because that could further perpetuate wrong. And so it's quite important to establish that immediate rapport and space. Secondly, we need to have the right support for this. We can't all be jacks of all trade. So in this situation, that person needs support, and there needs to be a lot more of the therapy coming through an organization.
Your industrial psychologists or your HR department, etc.
Should have, they should have counselors. So you'd have a multidisciplinary team of people that would now be attending to this. It's not saying I accept everything she's saying, but there's a support factor from the emotional, psychological perspective. There's the legal factor that comes through. And then there's obviously an exercise of rights. And some people don't want to exercise their rights. And most importantly, as in this Liberty case...
Exercise their rights in terms of the perpetrator.
Yeah.
Because he, like we spoke about intention, it might not have been his intention. And here he finds himself in a very sticky situation. He could potentially lose his job. Yeah. Possibly his marriage may break up if he's a married man. So there's a lot for him to lose.
Yeah, so at that stage, when we have that complaint, confidentiality is quite important. So in this Liberty case, and this was important because they did not preserve the confidentiality, and it blew out of proportion. In fact, that's where the risks do start increasing. The more people know, etc., there's a greater likelihood of further harassment, victimization,
and
taking sides, embarrassment, etc. So that must be preserved. And then secondly, the type of investigation that takes place is quite important, because again, we need to look at whether an act of sexual harassment had taken place. Is there a need for the organization to take appropriate action? And the quality of the investigation, I find, often is not of a standard that would actually deal with the complaints that are coming through. They're taken at a surface level. She's like this or he's like this. It can't be. In fact, even organizations do this. So there has to be a deeper investigation. In this Liberty matter, and I use Liberty not to target them, but it's a very popular case.
Yeah.
They, in fact, at the actual presentation of the case, did not even they denied that sexual harassment had taken place, but they didn't even bother to call the person who was the perpetrator, the alleged perpetrator, as a witness. So they didn't probe any further from that perspective. That's the level of power and tolerance that is given. So there needs to be a broad investigation. And if there isn't any complaint, don't go forward. But that particular person who's raised the complaint needs to then be assisted through this process, because there could be various reasons of why she's raised or he's raised the complaint.
we, I think, halfway through the final segment of the show. Ibrahim, what happens if there's no touching or no innuendos, but you do find that the guys go out for a smoke break, but they kind of damaging one of the female employees' reputation, whatever it is, and every time they go out for a smoke break, have a big laugh about it, and really shreds her to pieces. What does she do in a situation like that?
Well, I think there again, this is an exact form of harassment and
she has no
discrimination.
evidence, though. She overhears it, or someone comes and repeats it to her.
Yeah.
Does she still have a case?
Well,
But that's not sexual harassment, is that? That's would that still be sexual harassment?
See, if they harming her reputation internally, she can lodge a grievance internally. You've got to ask yourself, if there's a group of men standing there, have different positions of power, and they're shaming her effectively, and that would influence their decisions in terms of how they handle her from a business perspective. So she does suffer discrimination. There's a greater likelihood. Now, you've raised an important point, is that in all of these cases, I mean, we can intellectualize it as much as we can. They're often in secret. So whether it's the conversation that happens amongst a group of guys, it's a secret conversation. She's not there, she hears it. If it's physical or other forms of discrimination, it's going to happen with this person who's effectively a coward. He's not going to openly discriminate.
True.
He's not going to openly harass. And so it's a he said, she said situation. The degree of proof here is one that is quite important. Now, I want to just emphasize this. The courts have taken a very wise view of this. They've not said you need to have the highest standard of evidence. They recognize the fact that there's a psychological aspect to this, that people would obtain information differently. They would respond to this. They're not going to remember every single fact because of the issue. It may be a period of time that lapses. So they've said we've got to consider the evidence that is presented with a greater degree of objectivity and understanding what the person has gone through. I'm not saying everything will fly, but there's a higher degree of tolerance in understanding where the evidence should come from in these instances. So if people are suffering out there, and I think beyond just what we've been talking about, I think if you feel, and often people don't even realize they've been harassed because they've actually accepted it, I think seek assistance. I mean, that's my plea. Go out and get advice, speak to someone.
Sadly, name calling and teasing is also a big thing in corporate corridors. That's also a form of harassment, is it not?
Yeah.
May not be sexual harassment, but it is a form of harassment. The way you dress, people make comments, snide remarks about it, laugh about it, etc., or call you names for the way you look, or whatever the case may be. I've seen this happening over and over and over again. Do you have any recourse? It's not sexual harassment, but it is a form of harassment.
In fact, it is sexual harassment. If it links to your sexual conduct, if there's false allegations, the way you dress, she's like that, the kind of bravado male talk, that is in fact sexual harassment in itself as well. So the recourse is that if you pick it up, take it up to your ER and HR, and you need to make them aware that this is what is going on. They need to assist you. And they need to provide the service, and they need to probe, they need to come to your assistance. So the issue of evidence is always going to exist in most cases, but if we start, and you don't have to go immediately and say, well, I'm going to charge these people, but you can start probing what's going on. And there can be subtle ways of investigating within workplaces, because the advantage in workplaces, they confined environments in most instances, so you can investigate in a very subtle way to discover whether these things are happening. What we do as well for organizations, we do audits of practices, because practices are more difficult. And we start looking at different types of practices in organizations, and we call them out. And we call them out because they accept it. It's a practice. You won't even see it as wrong, like you use your example.
So harassment of any form, sexual or otherwise, it could be female on female harassment.
Absolutely.
Or male on male harassment, because I won't say we're not aware of it, but a lot of that does happen. But people just keep quiet about it because they're embarrassed, they're ashamed, they don't want to create a fuss because they're going to then be targeted or marked as the troublemaker, sadly. So they just keep quiet and carry on as per normal. And we hear of so many people who hate going to work. They hate their jobs simply because there's someone out there that's making their lives absolutely miserable.
So bullying is a form of harassment. So all forms of bullying, because effectively it is.
Sexual harassment is bullying as well.
It's absolutely. It's
sexual bullying. So with 2 minutes to wrap up, let's just remind our viewers once again about the seminar and what kind of 2 or 3 very important tips that you want to leave our viewers with this morning.
Okay. So the seminar takes place on the 28th of February at the Rooftop restaurant in Saxonville on Oxford Street. Contact us through our website, www.mediateworks.com, or on our number 087 1505 283. That's 087 1505 283. Attend the seminar. It's a low cost, high level of expertise there, and you can engage with us on the difficulties that you're facing, and we can perhaps guide you in the right way. Tips for us, it's important, and I think that's quite true. Don't underestimate the importance of managing sexual harassment. Secondly, as well, it is a lot more complex than just the physical. There are innuendos, there's the subtleties, there's the undetected. Education is quite key, whether it's in our homes, and we need to read up often, because we gain our understanding of how to respond to people elsewhere. So secondly, start educating. Don't assume you know it all. Thirdly, policies and law are important to have in place, and the right ones, but it's the willingness to embark upon it, even if you're a small business, because the damage you cause to the individuals, to the organization, is far too great, and it'll be too late to say, let me do it later on. In fact, it breaks up organizations as a consequence of this. And so importantly, take it on. And fourthly, is to, at times we don't know it all. I think in this area especially, get an external person to offer you advice that's independent of your hang-ups.
And that's where we leave it. Thank you indeed for a very insightful discussion, very serious discussion, and something that we don't want to plow our minds to simply because we think it ain't going to happen to me. No. I'm not going to become a victim, or I'm not going to be a perpetrator, but guess what? It might just.
Sure. Absolutely.
Thank you indeed.
It's a pleasure, and thank you for having us on your show.
My pleasure indeed. Don't forget, diarise the date, the 28th of February, with Mediate Works at the Rooftop, and it is a 2-hour seminar on sexual harassment. We've touched on a few matters as far as harassment, bullying, and sexual harassment is concerned, but I think if you attend the seminar, you'll get so much more out of it. Hope you've enjoyed the show with Ibrahim Patelia. Don't go away. We are now going to talk protection orders. Welcome back, and this of course is the legal hour, I should imagine. Earlier on we had Ibrahim Patelia talking about sexual harassment in the workplace. Now we are joined by another lawyer. His name is Mohammed Vali. We're going to talk protection orders, but before we get into it, we're going to ask Mohammed to introduce himself and tell us a little bit about his practice. Assalamu alaikum, welcome.
Wa alaikum salam. Shukran for having me here. It's quite an honor and a privilege. I've been in practice for about 10 years now. By way of speciality, I'm actually a patent attorney, so I do a lot of intellectual property matters. I also do litigation, and that led me to protection orders into the family court, where we'll have a discussion on the effect of those creatures in a few minutes.
Okay, when you talk about patent issues, trademarks and patents, is it a big thing in our country? And it's huge in the United States.
Well, it's a big thing throughout the world. There's various multinational organizations, NPOs, that deal with the advancement of intellectual property laws. In South Africa, it is big, not as big as what one would expect the market to be in Europe or in the States, but I think that we do have enough work to keep several large firms quite busy. But hopefully we can talk about those subjects which are very interesting
at another time, inshallah. So for this interview today, we're going to talk protection orders.
Yes.
We're going to talk harassment. We're going to talk all of the, well, I should imagine that falls under protection orders as well. So let's start off right at the beginning and ask the question, when we talk protection orders, are we talking purely about a domestic situation, maybe an abusive husband or an abusive wife, or perhaps even abusive children? So what exactly is a protection order? And in the same light, we need to ask the question, what sort of abuse can you be protected against?
Okay. It's a very relevant and interesting question. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of that answer, I think it would be appropriate and cautious to state that the intention of this morning's discussion is to essentially give an introduction to a topic. If we were to canvass the topics in detail, I think we would need several such programs. So the idea is to basically alert your readers or your listeners, viewers, apologies. The idea is to alert your viewers to the existence of remedies available in terms of the law that falls outside of the ambit of the criminal courts.
Exactly. So this would be under the ambit of the family courts or family law.
Correct. It's a civil remedy, a very expeditious remedy available to a complainant in order to get relief from oppressive conduct or abusive conduct. Also, another word of caution is that this is not intended to be advice to anyone. If someone identifies themselves with situations that may fall within the scope of the acts that we're about to speak about, they should consult with a lawyer, ideally, or they should proceed to the family court and consult with a relevant functionary in order to get proper, tailor-made advice for their particular dilemma. In most instances, these issues are fact-dependent, so your facts may be interpreted differently to somebody else's facts. But the relief and the mechanisms available for victims of abuse are here, and you can utilize it effectively and efficiently. Now, before we get into answering your question, we take a step back and we identify what are the relevant structures available to a person who is being abused. Say, for instance, a typical scenario, husband hits a wife. She's got options available to her. She can either go to the local police station that has jurisdiction over her area of residence, and she can go and lodge charges of assault or assault GBH, depending on the severity of the assault. She can also approach the family court, such as the family court in Johannesburg, if she resides within that jurisdiction, and she can go and take out a protection order under the Domestic Violence Act. That is one of the acts that deals with abuse. There's another act that we call the Protection from Harassment Act. Now, to distinguish between the two, one considers the Domestic Violence Act to apply to parties who are in some sort of a domestic relationship. So at some point in time, they lived together, they were husband and wife, they were in a universal partnership, boyfriend and girlfriend, perhaps they were engaged to each other. But it is a step closer than just a normal relationship between two unrelated parties.
All right, can I just stop you
Yes,
there?
of course.
Let's look at the situation of two unrelated parties.
Yes.
If, let's assume they're working together, or they're living close by, neighbors, whatever the case may be, and there's abuse of some form, physical abuse between them, can one then apply for a protection order, or does that fall under another law?
It falls under a different act. Now, the remedy that would be available there is known as the Protection from Harassment Act. It is very similar to the solutions provided by the Domestic Violence Act, but it is for a different purpose.
Right.
And at least in my view, it was created in response to social media attacks from unknown parties on individuals. We've all read, I think, in social media circles and elsewhere about people who are bullied through cyberbullying. Somebody from an unknown number sends you a threatening text message, or an abusive one for that matter. It could be someone within the confines of a domestic relationship, but you don't necessarily know that. So if you cannot prove the existence of a domestic relationship, then the provisions of the Domestic Violence Act doesn't apply to you. Then you seek relief under the Protection from Harassment Act. Now, an applicant or a complainant under the Domestic Violence Act can also utilize the mechanisms of the Protection from Harassment Act. But it is not necessarily the case that someone who is eligible for the protection of harassment interdict can easily utilize a domestic violence application as part of the relief. And the reason why is because it hinges upon the definition of, is there a domestic relationship between the parties? If there isn't, in the case of your example, between two neighbors, then it wouldn't be competent to go under a DV, just a shortened abbreviation for domestic violence. You would rather go under the PHA, the Protection from Harassment Act, simply because it was fashioned to deal with instances of non-domestic relationships where there's abuse or similar oppressive conduct that is being perpetrated against the complainant.
When a woman, many women tolerate the abuse for years on end. I know it's a very general statement, but a lot of women do, until they reach a point of not being able to tolerate it any longer, and then they finally decide to take out a protection order against their spouse or their partner. What happens if it falls into place? And you'll explain to us how it works. Yes. They appear before magistrate, the case is heard, the protection order is served. He now still continues living in the same house, and they go through a honeymoon period, and then after a while the abuse starts up again. What is going to happen to that man, to the perpetrator?
Well, there's several answers to your question. It's also a very interesting question, is that our law does give recognition to the fact that abuse in domestic relationships is hidden, typically. It has a repetitive character.
Absolutely.
Because the victim falls under one or more psychological principles. I think Stockholm Syndrome is one.
Yes.
Where they identify with their kidnappers, in a sense, or their abusers. And they tolerate it. They make excuse after excuse, and they live under the subjugation. Now,
despite all the violence and the terror, they still feel a sense of loyalty and love to that person.
Correct.
As sick as it may sound.
Correct. And that's it. That person is a victim. They require some sort of treatment or intervention, but that is something that psychologists can speak more meaningfully to. We as lawyers simply identify that it exists, and our courts give recognition to that fact. Typically what happens is there's a trigger. The trigger is the latest form of abuse that forces the victim to go to court to seek relief. And it is on the basis of that trigger that relief can be granted on an interim basis. Now, you must remember that this is not a court of emotion, and it's not a court of equity, it is a court of law. You have to abide by the principles that our law expects of you as an applicant. If you want to go and make out a case, you must provide the facts that support that case.
What sort of facts would they expect you to provide evidence in, in this instance?
Evidence in relation to the trigger incident is obviously of the greatest importance. So tell the court, why are you here? What forced you to come to court to seek relief from court officials? And once you cover that, and you mustn't leave any fact out, because this is the type of application that is known as an ex parte application, meaning no notice is given to the respondent in the initial approach to court. The court will consider your application and can give you interim protection for the time being, provided you make out a case for interim protection.
What is interim protection?
Interim protection is a court order that will operate as if it were a final order, but for a time-limited period, to afford the other side an opportunity to come to court and say, either the order was wrongly granted or the facts are incorrect, so I'm here to challenge the validity of that order. But for the time being, the status quo is remained, meaning that the court will say, your abuse stops. They'll put in mechanisms or orders that speak to mechanisms in order to provide some sort of relief from the oppressive or abusive conduct. The other side is obviously going to then receive notice of the complaint. They can then come to court on a date that the order would specify in order to challenge the order or to make the order final. So once you get a final order, then you can basically say, right, now we've got something firmly in place. If there's further perpetuations of violence or abuse, then there's another mechanism available to stop that, and that is a warrant of arrest is issued. That warrant of arrest is suspended. It's kept at your local police station. On affidavit that records a subsequent breach of the order, you can get the perpetrator locked up immediately. They would then have to go to court, and it would then take the form of criminal proceedings because you are in breach of a court order, which is a crime. So
and I should imagine women are a bit reluctant to go that route because in many cases their abuser is their partner or their husband, and if they get him locked up, that would mean that he's out of work, and that places them in a bigger and a deeper dilemma. But let's take an ad break. We'll respond to that right after it. Okay. Mo Valley, or Mohammed Valley, who has a practice in Rosebank, Johannesburg, is here talking to us about protection orders. Don't go away, still lots more to uncover on the show. We're talking domestic violence, we're talking protection orders, harassment orders, and a whole lot more with Mo Valley, who has a law practice in Rosebank, Johannesburg. You want to respond to the issue around women being obviously the victims of domestic violence. You don't totally agree with me, do you?
Yes and no. Look, in the past, historically, women were seen to be the greater victims of domestic violence issues, simply because people view them as the fairer sex, you know, the weaker sex that is, they're unable to protect themselves physically in most instances. But there's an interesting trend emerging. Whether it existed prior to the observation of this trend or not is debatable, but men, and a significant number of them, are also victims of domestic violence. They go to court to seek relief when it becomes so oppressive that they have no other alternative but to go to somebody and ask for help. So in as much as we view domestic violence incidents with women as victims, there are many instances where men are being physically abused, mentally abused, emotionally abused, and economically abused as well.
Let's look at the mentally and emotionally. How does one prove that? By recordings, I should imagine?
Well, the burden of evidence has become a little bit easier given the advent of social media, because human, or let's call it human nature, is such that they have to say something. And one typically finds evidence of abuse in the form of a conversation on WhatsApp or on SMS. That is the first resort. Show me what you have done or said on WhatsApp. And it's, it's uncanny that because there's this barrier between two people, a communication platform, people actually speak freely. They speak their minds. You see the true nature of the abuser or the aggressor on WhatsApp, be it husband or wife. And in fact, if somebody goes to the court and they say, I'm tired of my husband, he's constantly swearing at me and he's belittling me and he's doing everything to hurt me mentally and psychologically, and you go and you review that conversation, and it's rather interesting to observe that it's two ways. That in as much as hubby is swearing wife, wife is swearing hubby as well. That doesn't constitute a domestic abusive relationship. It may be a dysfunctional relationship, which are not necessarily abusive, but all abusive relationships are, of course, dysfunctional.
Let's go back to the abusive relationship. So when you present this evidence to the court, obviously, if it's mentally and emotional, it's not physically abuse that's being perpetrated. Can a protection order be served against that type of abuse as well?
Yes, it can. Now, let's go back one step and just look at the types of conduct that the Act speaks to. It speaks about physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, psychological harm. I seem to forget the full list, but the qualifying criteria is that it must be the type of conduct that either harms or imminently harms the safety, well-being and health of a person. If you qualify for any one of those, any one or more, then it satisfies the test to obtain protection in terms of the DV Act. Now, it's very rare that the type of conduct that goes to a court as subject of a complaint fits very neatly into any one of those categories. They usually are multiples of that type of conduct. If he's going to swear you and belittle you, it is a form of mental psychological abuse. He may well raise his hand to you, or she, and that's physical abuse. The person who may be controlling the purse strings may turn around and say, well, I'm kicking you out of the house. I'm not interested in your nonsense anymore. So that could be a form of economic abuse simply because you are not the person who's able to afford alternative accommodation. You may not necessarily have family members who are able to take you in and look after you for the time being. Even if they do, it doesn't mask the type of abuse.
In a situation like that, can the courts then force the husband to provide financially for the wife because he's kicked her out, or he refuses to give her money to run the home? Are they able to force that onto him?
Yes.
By way of, I think they approach the company that he works at, and I think they can actually, there's a special term about deducting monies from his salary.
Yeah, look, they can do
Garnishee
that, but,
orders.
a garnishee order, but before they do that, the court can make a pronouncement as a court order to say emergency monetary relief provisions will kick in. If there's minors that are involved in an abusive scenario, the court can intervene for the time being and remove them from that particular set of facts. In addition, if it's going to be, in a sense, a perpetuation of the abuse that the complainant is suffering because the abuser refuses to move out of the house, a court can order that they will not enter a certain part of the house, that they will be confined to, let's say, the first floor, the ground floor, the lounge, and maybe a guest bedroom. The main bedroom and the kitchen, everything else could be the sanctity in terms of the court order for the complainant. If a court decides, listen, you don't have the comfort of space, so I'm going to order that the complainant reside at the house and you must go and reside elsewhere, they can make that order, but everything would depend on the facts. It depends on how you fashion your complaint, the type of detail that you allege, and whether or not you make out a prima facie case for relief.
So the short answer to everything that we've talked about up to now is that there is hope.
Yes.
For people who are victims in domestic situations. There is hope, and it's not a situation where it gets dragged out for weeks and months on end. You can go there and ask for emergency protection and can kick in almost immediately. That being said, what about a situation of children that are being abused physically, sexually, and otherwise? What do we do to protect those children? Would the protection order be sufficient?
It could be used as a mechanism because somebody can bring a protection order on behalf of somebody else. But if that scenario presents itself, you must disclose to the court the reason why that person can't bring that complaint themselves.
So you're
in
referring
the case
to
of a minor,
yeah, okay.
then a parent or someone in the position of a parent or guardian or maybe even an interested party can approach the court and say, hang on, something's happening here, it is wrong, here's the evidence as to why I say what I say, grant an interdict for purposes of protecting that child. But it's not the best mechanism to use for children. The Children's Act actually has better, more comprehensive mechanisms aimed at their protection, where a child in an abusive environment can be removed by the state on a complaint made to either a social worker or a police official. I believe the section is section 146 of the Children's Act, but they can be immediately taken out of that environment, put into a safe house, pending an investigation and an outcome of the circumstances that may have led to that complaint.
How long do protection orders last for? Let's assume the woman goes and has a protection order served on her husband, and for 6 months, and I think I asked this question earlier on, you go through a honeymoon period and then the violence or the abuse kicks in again.
Yes.
So does that mean you've got to go start from scratch and go and apply for another protection order, or does this kind of almost stand for life?
No, it doesn't. It's a time-limited period. I stand to be corrected, 2 years, renewable every 2 years, but 2 or 5 years, I apologize. It depends on what relief you get from the court. If you've got an interim order, you're going to have to go back to court because the respondent has a right to due process. If there's a defense that he intends or she intends to raise, that defense must be vacated before the order can be made final, or the order could be discharged if there isn't a triable case to be made. There's a number of instances where malicious applications in terms of the DV Act has been made to court simply because the parties are undergoing a divorce and they simply can't agree to each other. So one party decides, I'm going to now get the upper hand by engineering a factual scenario that could speak to this. So courts are alive to that as well. They're not simply going to issue out protection orders for the asking. You need to prove that you have a triable case or sustainable case.
You talk about malicious intent. So let's assume the wife has malicious intent and she goes ahead and applies for this protection order. What is the husband's or the partner's circumstances as far as work issues are concerned? He's at work and the malicious partner then phones and says, there's a protection order against him, and kind of bad mouths him as far as the workplace is concerned. Does he stand to lose his job, or is it just really about credibility there?
It's going to depend on the temperament and the attitude of the people that he reports to. But, and this is the point, that domestic violence applications can be abused. And in some instances, it is abused, just in order to prove a point or to gain a strategic litigation advantage against the other side. But with an astute litigant or an attorney, you can overturn that malicious intent by demonstrating that it didn't happen. It's going to take a bit of time. You have to go through the process. There's going to be several remands. You're going to have to show on affidavit why you are countering the charges leveled against you. The other side will have an opportunity to reply. The magistrate will then determine whether or not the matter can be decided on affidavit, or if it requires additional evidence. People can be called as witnesses, and you can test viva voce or verbally the testimony of both parties and their witnesses. The court then balances this on a standard of proof known as on a balance of probabilities, weighs up the competing versions, and then decides whose version is reasonably possibly true, and then will grant relief in relation to that party. If the complaint weighs heavier in the balance, then obviously the complaint or the complainant's application will be granted. But if there is doubt to bear upon the complainant's version and the respondent puts up a case that weighs in heavier on the balance of probabilities, then the order, if it's an interim order, will be discharged. So the court has several options available to it. It can either grant an interim order, or it can give notice to the respondent to come and appear and explain why an order shouldn't be given in these terms. Once you get to that point, the interim order, if granted, could be made a final order, or it could be discharged, meaning the court would set it aside and the parties are released free to go. It doesn't mean that one can't pursue alternative remedies. If there was swearing, there was physical violence involved, and you decided to call the police and there's a criminal case that's pending, those are separate proceedings. So this court is going to look at the facts that you present before it, and it will make a judicial pronouncement on the basis of those facts. Do you meet the requirements or don't you meet the requirements?
Let's go for an ad break. I'm talking to Mo Valley. We're talking protection orders. Don't go away. We are going to be talking some more in our final segment on the show today. And we're into the final section of the show this morning. Serious stuff indeed. We're talking protection orders, we're talking harassment orders, we're talking about domestic violence and a whole host more. I hope you're enjoying the show. Back to you. And earlier on you touched on the issue around harassment, very especially as far as social media is concerned. A lot of us are at a loss because you do get people, really sick people, who send out sick, defaming messages to people from private numbers or unlisted numbers or, you know, whatever means available to them, and they harass you. Is there anything at all that can be done to try and trace the identity of that person? And what can be done against them?
Okay. The question holds a great amount of validity in our age, the information age, simply because of the availability of social media platforms as a means of communication to a number of people, almost immediately, real-time communication through WhatsApp and similar platforms. And we all have heard of stories, or we've seen movies where somebody makes a silly video simply because they're silly. But the contents of that video can destroy a person.
Oh,
They're
absolutely.
in various states of undress, or they found in a compromising situation, and it's as easy as flicking a thumb to simply forward that content to somebody else, and then somebody else, and somebody else. And the buzzword about that is it goes viral. And it can destroy a person. It can harm them severely. The outcome, or the regrettable outcome in a number of these high-profile cases that have been reported in the media, is that people tend to commit suicide as a result of the pressure.
Yes.
So it is a very serious thing.
It is absolutely soul-destroying.
Yes.
And and thus you hear about these suicides. Just to take you one step back, and then you can complete your thought on this matter as well, is let's assume someone has forwarded anonymously or otherwise a very explicit video of another person in my social circle. Is the onus of responsibility on me to put a stop to it there and then, or am I as guilty as charged if I then allow it to go viral?
Yes. The answer is that anyone along the chain of publication will be held as responsible as the originator of the message.
And people are not aware of this.
No, they're not. They feel that it was just a message I received. I just forwarded it. I didn't really know the effect, but the effect is serious because you contribute to the virility of that message going and reaching all four corners of the earth. So you can be held responsible criminally, depending on the content, if the content is explicit, sexually explicit. There are provisions in terms of the Films and Publications Act that speak to your publication, in a sense, of this content. And you can face criminal sanction there, apart from civil interdicts. But in terms of the PHA, the Protection of Harassment Act, the victim can approach the court, even if they don't know the identity of the person that either sent the message to them or sent the message to a person who is willing to assist them to identify the number or some or other code, like an IMEI number or an IP address that can be associated with the message content. There's certain information in every single message known as metadata, which a forensic analyst or an IT specialist can go and analyze, extract certain key identifiers that would point to who the author of the message might be. How do we get there? You go to either the family court, who are your primary port of call for PHA applications, but if the matter is sufficiently urgent, any court having jurisdiction in relation to this matter, including the High Court, can give an order in relation to an interdict here. Now, you can't get an interdict against a person unknown. So what a court would then do is grant an order authorizing that a service provider, whichever service provider it might be, and I believe that we're limited to 4 in this country, they are ordered to disclose information that is available on their systems that could lead to the pointing out of the identity of that person. If the message came through a different form, the court can order that a member of the South African police in the locality in which the victim resides go out and investigate this matter in order to give identity to the perpetrator of this abuse. Once you've identified that perpetrator, you then call them to court.
And you obviously open up charges, criminal charges or whatever it is against them.
Yes, depending on what laws they've broken, you can open up a plurality of charges.
That would be harassment, would it not?
As long as there's no domestic relationship, then yes,
then
it would
it's
fall
harassment.
squarely under the Protection of Harassment Act.
What sort of, and I know again it's a very general question and it would differ from case to case, but in a situation like this where possibly your reputation is going to be damaged or has been damaged irreparably, what sort of sentences can you hope these people get meted out? Would they be paying a fine and get away with it, or would they serve time in jail? Because they've, as you said, some people, the situation has actually ended in suicide.
Yes. It's going to depend on case to case, what has been done where, but once you satisfy the definition of any particular crime, our state or our legislation has prescribed certain minimum sentences for perpetrators of crime. If the conduct falls within one or more of these categories, then yes, there could be the operation of a sentence or suspended sentence in the case of a first-time offender, possibly with or without the option of a fine. But it's very serious conduct, and that's the point. So I would caution our viewers and their children and anyone else who's on social media for that matter to think about what it is that you're doing before you do it. There could be consequences. It may seem mischievous, it may seem harmless for the time being. Put yourself in that person's shoes and think about what could happen. You could unwittingly end up before a court to answer a protection from harassment application or an interdict.
We're almost come to the end of the show, but just 2-3 very quick questions. When we look at the issue around harassment or protection orders, does that impact on you as far as looking for a job is concerned, or even if you're gainfully employed, and if someone tips off your employer, let's assume, hopefully it's not a very malicious partner, but somehow the other someone comes across the fact that you have got a protection order against you. Are you meant to be disclosing it in your job interview, on your application?
It would depend on your employer. They usually do a criminal background check. Orders in relation to domestic violence interdicts don't typically appear on your criminal record unless you've breached the order. And now there's criminal proceedings that have been issued against you. But outside of that context, if one simply looks at the existence of a domestic violence interdict, by its very nature, the connotation suggests that you are the type of person that nobody wants to be associated with. So it can have a very serious effect on your employability, your future employability, especially if the application was a malicious one and it's pending.
Right.
So, and this is the point, a lot of people will simply go to court and say, I can't afford an attorney, I don't know what to do in this matter, let me just accept the order, get it granted, I didn't do anything wrong, but it will get her out of my life or it will get him out of my life and I don't have to deal with them any longer as long as I've got this protection order. But then try and look or peer into the future. You've got this against your name. If you make a disclosure, it could harm you. In circumstances when you were not the aggressor or you didn't perpetrate this conduct. So be careful as to what you agree to or what you permit yourself. So try and protect
your rights.
Correct.
Finally, and this is not what we've been talking about, but just very quickly, if you have a criminal record, it could be anything, it could be a petty crime or it could be even something serious. Does that suggest that you won't be able to travel to certain countries internationally?
Some countries' visa requirements do have restrictions on the existence of either criminal record or pending criminal charges. It depends on which country. But yes, it does restrict your movement. So if you are guilty, then you're guilty. But if you're not, do not fall into the trap of just adopting the easy way out. I know with speeding tickets in particular, a lot of people
just want to pay the fines and get it over with.
Let me pay the admission of guilt without
understanding the consequences. And I was actually referring to speeding tickets, by the way.
Okay, great minds. But that's the point. You pay the admission of guilt, there's a record against your name, and it could serve to limit your free ability to travel to countries of your choices.
So that's actually a criminal record on your... I mean, you have a criminal record, yes. X amount of traffic fines, which you've ignored or maybe in...
No, not the fine per se. I mean, a fine is an administrative issue.
Yeah.
But if you are in breach of paying the fine or you've been called to appear in court, for example...
Failed to appear in court.
You've exceeded the speed limit, say 165 is the speed that you were caught on in a 120 zone. That is something where you have to now appear in court without question. There's no bail or anything of that nature. And then proceedings are instituted against you. If you're in default of your appearance or putting in a defense, then yes, that can result in a criminal record being granted against you, simply because the court makes a pronouncement on your guilt.
Okay, and finally, your last words on protection orders. What should people be aware of and how careful should they navigate around the space?
In as much as it's there to protect people who are being abused, I implore the general population, don't use it as a means to abuse someone else. It is there for very serious cases, very real cases where there are real victims of abuse, where if an intervention is not given, it could easily turn into a case of murder.
Sure.
Don't abuse it. If you don't like your husband or your wife, divorce them. Don't take them to domestic violence courts simply because it's available to you.
Right.
If you are a victim, it is there, use it. But if you're not a victim, please leave the courts for those who are victims. Give them the space. Courts are congested as it is. We don't need unnecessary applications going to court.
And that's where we leave it. Thank you indeed for your expertise on this matter. That was attorney Mohammed Valley. He has a practice in Rosebank, Johannesburg, talking to us about Protection Act, the Protection Act and protection orders and harassment orders, and a whole lot more. Sincerely hope you've enjoyed the discussion this morning. Time for us to wrap up. A big thank you to the Let's Talk production team. Please take care on the roads. Until next Wednesday at the same time as always, it is Assalamu Alaikum and Khuda Hafiz from me, Julie Alli.
Ya hala, 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 حن قلبي على جمعة الخير هلا، حن قلبي على جمعة الخير هلا، يا هلا ويا هلا ويا هلا ويا هلا، يا هلا ويا